just heard that the recording stopped. But
yes,
yes,
because to cut this out from what I've just said, I'm just bringing it to your kind attention.
Okay, why don't we start then? And let me start by thanking ERF for asking me to moderate this this session. And we have many distinguished panelists from whom we have learned a lot, how the MENA region got here today, where it is today, and also about the future. And today we will focus on the future and in a particular dimension, which is the demographic interplay with the developments that we are anticipating to come in the near future. Perhaps we will not complicate it with the advent of COVID, but if the panelists have to say something on that, that will be a bonus. I will not spend time in introducing the panelists. Most of us know most of them, starting with Nader, who has been an academic, has been an administrator, and he has the rare experience of having also worked at an NGO. And then Raghi, of course, has a very distinguished academic profile, and having been director of the Population Council in Cairo, he is the best equipment for today's session. Then we will have Caroline, who is an academic, and she's very young, and the age-adjusted career in publications fully match those of Nader and Raghi, and more is to come soon. And last but not least, we have Ghada Barsoum, whom I have not met, I think, but I have learned a lot from what she has written on job security, informality, the youth education, all of which relate to what we will cover today. So today we're talking about the interplay between the demographics and what to expect here in the labor market. And perhaps the panelists can address how we expect the demographics to come into the labor markets and how the labor markets can better be prepared for this change. And also what kind of strategies the countries may have, or the strategies the panelists can propose, so that we can cope with the expected job creation needs amidst the fourth industrial revolution. And we may also cover, what is the state of automation at this moment and in the near future in the MENA region. If agreed, we can have each panelist address these questions in whatever way they feel better, in a comprehensive way, for something like 15-20 minutes. And I would also ask them to give us 1 minute at the beginning to tell us where they are physically now, and their current affiliation and their current research, so we know them better for those who do not know them. And after the presentation, we will allocate another 20 minutes or so to go over the questions and comments that the participants, the attendees of this session may have to raise. So we can we can start with Raghi probably, and then go to Nader, then to Caroline, and then to Ghada. So Raghi, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Zafiris, for this introduction. I'm really happy to start off this very interesting panel. I'm currently located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the US. It's morning for me, so good morning, everyone. And I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota, Humphrey School of Public Affairs. So I wanted to organize my comments basically around 4 main points that I will tell you in advance, and then I will go and develop them a little bit more. And the first is that by far the most important demographic phenomenon in the past 50 years in the MENA region has been the youth bulge. And the youth bulge is a phenomenon that, in a sense, we can see in the rearview mirror because, as I'll argue, it has passed. But it has long-lasting and impacts on the nature of labor supply in the MENA region, and I will describe those impacts. And currently, we are actually in a period of reduced demographic pressure on the labor market because the generation that follows the youth bulge is actually smaller. But these pressures will intensify very soon, resulting in very sharp upward pressure on unemployment and labor markets in general as a result of the so-called echo of the youth bulge. And so not only do we need to maintain and sustain high rates of growth to create enough jobs for this, what a person in the previous panel called the tsunami of the youth bulge. So we have a second tsunami that is coming and we need to get ready for. But the structural nature of growth has to change in the direction that provides more formal, more stable jobs that are based on rising productivity rather than the pattern that we have followed so far in the region with fairly low productivity informal jobs. So let me kind of elaborate on these points. So the youth bulge phenomenon, let me define it first, is the increase in the share of youth in the population at a certain point in the demographic transition. That increased share is driven by increases in childhood survival rates that then with lagging fertility decline. So fertility doesn't decline right away, but it takes time. And so during that intermediate period, there's a huge increase in the proportion of youth in the population. Now, it is a fairly generalized phenomenon across the global south, but in MENA, it was particularly intense, given the large and rapid declines in early childhood mortality in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and the relatively slow decline and even stalling of fertility declines that followed. So we had a pretty marked youth bulge in MENA. Now, the peak of the youth bulge in MENA occurred around 2000, 2005. This is when the share of the youth aged 15 to 24 peaked at about 1/5 of the entire population on average in MENA. And this was also a period of intense labor supply pressures, which combined with increased educational attainment resulted in the highest youth unemployment rates in the world for this region, which we also know still exists till today. So we might ask, what is the relevance of a phenomenon that peaked in the early 2000s to the question of the future of work in the region? Should we not be reaping the demographic dividends from these developments as members of this youth bulge generation reach adulthood, become productive members of society, and thus reducing economic and demographic dependency, at least for a while? And it is true that the youth bulge generation is now well into its prime working age. Currently, they are centered around ages 35 to 45 in most of the countries of the region. And yes, they have entered employment, at least among males. And among women, many of them have actually withdrawn from the labor force after being unemployed for a while to care for families and other reasons. So putting aside the very low and deteriorating quality of employment that many of these members of the youth bulge generation have had to accept, and the falling participation rates among educated women as access to public sector jobs dried up, for example, from a demographic perspective, we're actually better off than in the early 2000s, when demographic pressures on labor markets were most intense. And so given that, what is the real issue for the future of work in MENA? And in illustrating this, I'm going to use Egypt as an example. The trends I describe are from a paper that I just completed on the population and labor force prospects in Egypt from 2000 to 2050, which is available as an ERF working paper, and I'll put up the link after I'm finished talking. And the reason Egypt is actually a good example to illustrate what's happening in the region is because it closely represents the dominant pattern for MENA. In fact, the timing and size of the youth bulge in Egypt is about exactly the same as it is for MENA as a whole. Some parts of the region, such as Tunisia and Lebanon, had earlier peaks of the youth bulge, and some like Jordan, Iraq, Palestine, and Yemen had later peaks. But the dynamic I described for Egypt is fairly similar across the region. And so we had a rapid increase in the number of youth from 2000 to 2010. That rapid increase slowed down appreciably from 2010 to 2020. In fact, there was an actual contraction in the number of youth in the labor force from 2010 to 2015. I mean, that's something that most people don't think about. They all think about the youth bulge as being there with us. But in fact, there was a big change in the pressure, the demographic pressure on labor market entry. Now, while growth in the labor force has resumed since 2015, it's projected to be less than 1% per year through 2025. So very weak demographic pressures at this point in time. Now, this slowdown in the youth population and labor force is the main reason why we have seen unemployment rates in the region in general, and in Egypt in particular, follow a downward trend since the end of the 2000s. Now, of course, this is with the exception of the short period immediately following the Arab Spring, where unemployment rates went up. But generally, if you look at the trend since the early 2000s, it's been downward. And this decline in unemployment occurred even though the proportion of the working age population that is working, that is employed, is actually going down. The so-called employment to population ratio is declining. So there's a bit of a paradox here. Is it possible for the unemployment rate to decline when employment rates are also going down? And the answer is, so long as the growth of the labor force is also decelerating, yes, it is possible. And this deceleration comes from the dramatic slowdown in the youth population in the years that followed the youth bulge. Now, while the slowdown in the growth of the youth population is a welcome trend from the point of view of youth unemployment in MENA, it is unfortunately only very temporary in nature. It's a phenomenon, so the phenomenon that's known as the echo of the youth bulge will soon reverse this trend and results in a substantial renewed demographic pressure on labor supply beginning around 2025 and lasting for at least 1 decade, if not a little bit longer. So what is this echo of the youth bulge? It is essentially the increase in births that occurred as a result of the population momentum associated with the youth bulge generation. So population momentum occurs when a large cohort reaches childbearing age, and by its sheer size, increasing the overall birth rate. So as the youth bulge generation reached childbearing age in the mid-2000s, the number of births in Egypt started to increase substantially. And the Egyptian case is a good example of that. In fact, this substantial population momentum was further exacerbated by an increase in fertility rates during this period. So not only is the number of mothers of childbearing age going up, each one of them is actually having more children in this period. And as Carolyn will show later, the fertility declines that were occurring prior to that had stalled between the mid-90s and the 2000s, and actually fertility increased between 2008 and 2012, which is really quite unusual for that to happen. So the superimposition of a fertility increase on top of a large population momentum resulted in a substantial baby boom in Egypt, roughly from 2000 to 2015. That generation, which we call the echo of the youth bulge. So in fact, the growth rate of the child population in Egypt accelerated explosively from about 0.2% per year in the period between 2000 and 2005 to 1.1% per year between 2005 and 2010 to 2.7% per year in 2010-2015. So going from 0.2% per year to 2.7% per year in a matter of 1 decade. Now, this baby boom, born mostly from 2005 to 2015, is putting enormous pressure on various parts of the system, so to speak, as it ages. So first, it affected the basic education system, which saw very high demographic pressures during the past decade. It will move next to the secondary and post-secondary education system, putting a lot of pressure on that. And it will begin putting intense pressure on labor markets starting in 2025, all the way through really 2040, if you look at the data. So according to my projections, labor force growth will increase by 1/3 from about 600,000 new entrants per year in 2020 to 2025, the next five-year period, to about 800,000 new entrants per year from 2030 to 35. And it will remain at that level through 2035-40 before receding again. So we have this big increase in the number of new entrants that are expected. Now, the characteristics of the new entrants will also change to a certain extent. 3/4 of these young new entrants will have either higher education, so that's about 1/4, or secondary and post-secondary education, that's about 50%. So it is a group with educational credentials that have traditionally aspired to formal employment and have been willing to queue for it among the ranks of the unemployed in the past. I therefore project that these demographic developments will translate into intense new upward pressures on unemployment starting in about 2025. The high levels of education, of course, among this echo generation do make it more eligible for jobs in the fourth industrial revolution and the digital economy. However, this will depend on the degree of their digital literacy and the quality of the education that they are able to obtain, which is doubtful given the demographic pressures that affected the education system as they are going through that system. Now, more importantly, however, than their qualifications is that these jobs need to materialize on the demand side of the labor market. Now, and that depends on the nature, the pace, and pattern of economic growth. So I estimate that it will take an employment growth rate of at least 2% per year to absorb just the growth in the labor force that is coming. This will probably require sustained economic growth at rates of 5 to 6% per year, which Egypt has actually achieved close to in recent years, but the pattern of that growth in recent years has been jobless, with actually a drop in the employment to population ratio over those few years. So it will require not only a change in the rate of growth, but in the pattern of growth towards that is less intensive and low productivity informal jobs based on the growth of the construction and real estate, for example, which have been dominant in recent years, to one that is more intensive in stable formal jobs that have rising productivity over time in sectors such as manufacturing and possibly some of the ICT and high-end services. So what is in store in the region given these demographic trends for the future of work? Well, the signs are that this kind of stable formal job type of growth is not likely to materialize. The gig economy makes it less rather than more likely for jobs to be formal and to carry social protection. And therefore, we need a big change in the institutional makeup of the labor market so that social protection is increasingly less linked to one's job and more linked to one's citizenship. And it's a kind of a rights-based system where social protection is linked to citizenship rather than jobs. Because jobs increasingly are going to look more and more like jobs that don't carry social protection. And I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A the effects of automation and technology on employment in MENA, although I think that we probably likely, a small part of the economy is likely to be affected by these trends, and we're more likely to be affected by the indirect effects of automation elsewhere in the world on what that means for labor demand in our region. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and also keeping to the time. You've been very good all these years in demystifying the paradoxes, and I was waiting to hear yet another paradox today. And of course, you very clearly distinguish between stocks and rates and flows. And you took the discussion to 2040, which is far beyond the horizon of any politician. But as you said, the challenge is quite big. I mean, 5 to 6% growth is not a small feat. And also we need to change the type of growth. And it's not just the demographic and economic situation. As we see in Tunisia these days, the social implications are extremely grave. And we all hope for the better in this respect. Thank you very much, Raghi. Let me now turn to Nader and hear from him whether he will go beyond the 2040. Nader, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zafiris. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to ERF and the Center for the Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth for organizing and inviting me to participate in this roundtable dialogue series. So I'm currently right now in Atlanta, in the US. I'm based out of Doha, and I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Senior Fellow there. And my current work involves looking at mostly development economics, some labor, and I'm increasingly getting more involved into post-conflict issues because I'm also. Can you hear? Yeah. Because I also have I lived in Syria for a while also before, and I'm also Syrian before the current crisis. And so have kind of an interest in seeing what happens post-conflict. So I especially like the dialogue's approach to building narratives. And what I'll try to do in my brief discussion is focus my comments on exploring and trying to contribute to a narrative for the MENA region. And let me start by kind of building on what Raghi was talking about and kind of take it one step further into looking about what really happened and how the region responded to the demographic challenges it faced. So as Raghi mentioned, we had the demographic issue in the region mostly focused in the past couple of decades on the issue of the youth bulge, where the share of youth in the population peaked at around 22% around 2002 to 2005. And to place this in context, globally currently the share of youth in the population today is around 16%. So 22% is a pretty high number. And it places, as Raghi mentioned, pressures on the education systems and the labor markets of the region as young people try to leave school and find work. So we know from the literature that countries that are able to successfully absorb these youth bulges and find jobs for the young people into the labor forces experience what they call a demographic dividend or gift. So this involves lower dependency ratios, where you have a higher number of people working, supporting a relatively smaller number of people who aren't, leading to higher savings and investment and higher economic growth potentially. So demographic changes are very important because, like other pressures, such as what we're talking about in our series, automation and digitalization and other ICT innovations, they present both challenges and opportunities. And so countries that are able to deal with them successfully can reap economic rewards. Countries that can't deal with them successfully suffer adverse consequences. So what happened in the Middle East? Raghi also also suggested that the governments and countries of the Middle East were not able to, actually failed to absorb the incoming cohorts of young people. So since 1990, youth unemployment rates in the region have hovered around 25%, consistently the highest in the world, while labor force participation rates have remained low. So there are many reasons for this, and we'll get into this, I'm sure. We've gotten into this in the past couple of days, and we'll continue to discuss these issues. These include the region's public sector development model and the social contract that's induced young people to queue for high-paying, often not very productive government jobs. The region has failed to allow a competitive private sector to develop and emerge and create jobs for incoming cohorts. And it's been weighed down with excessive bureaucracy, corruption, cronyism. And the region's education systems have failed to prepare young people for jobs in the private sector. that was supposed to support growth, and instead focused on creating credentials that are required for government jobs. So we have a combination of factors here, and others as well, but just kind of as a high level. So the consequences are clear. The region's failure to capitalize on the demographic transitions means that you had wasted economic potential at the individual and social levels, delayed transitions to adulthood, like marriage, family formation, civic participation, lower rates of economic growth that could have been possible had young people been able to be absorbed into the labor market and reach their full potential. There's been a large migration and brain drain, at least at the country level. Fortunately for the region, many of the people leaving the countries go to the Gulf, but even that's potentially a temporary phenomenon as oil and natural gas resource will eventually decline, and the region, the Gulf region, will no longer be able to really import as many unemployed young people from the region. And finally, as Zafiris mentioned and Ragi mentioned, and Zafiris emphasized, youth frustrations grew with unemployment and social, economic, and political exclusion, and exploded in 2011 into unrest that continues till today. So the question we want to ask in terms of the story is, what happened? Why did the region fail? And I'm going to argue it's mostly a failure of implementation. So let's start thinking through these issues. First of all, the MENA countries and the international community knew the relevance of the youth bulge and the importance of creating jobs for young people 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. They understood the why this was important. So in the early 2000s, the youth bulge in the region generated what could be called a call to action among donors, international organizations, countries of the region. One example is, upon leaving as president of the World Bank at the time, James Wolfenson set up a center at Brookings that focused to a large extent on youth economic inclusion in the Middle East. Conferences were organized, surveys and research were conducted throughout the region, national strategies were developed, policies were introduced, programs were launched. In fact, youth employment and entrepreneurship programs sprung up across the region. For one example, between 2007 and 2014, Egypt alone implemented over 180 projects related to youth employment. So the countries of the region, international community knew this was important, and they understood that they had to respond. They also, to a large extent, had a good idea of what needed to be done. So if you go back to the 1990s, both the international and the regional evidence on what works in youth employment was weak. There's lots of literature that tried to track evidence and didn't find much in the way of evidence, let alone what could be done. This has improved a lot. The region over the past 20 years has invested a lot in terms of research, in terms of surveys, and Ragi and the Population Council are to thank for a lot of those. So we have a lot of information about what's working and what the issues are. So what we need to do includes improving technical and basic skills of young people, reducing labor market distortions, nurturing a more dynamic and competitive private sector, providing resources for young entrepreneurs, including access to finance and mentorship and assets, providing early employment experiences for young people, improving labor market information systems and career guidance. And we have evidence from impact evaluations about what combinations of those factors are most effective. So where countries really fell short was in figuring out how to ensure that youth employment policies and programs were being implemented effectively. Basically, we're talking about a failure of governance. So oftentimes, the failure of governance was led by political considerations, issues of expediency, and these factors generally trumping sound policy and programming. There was also very much a lack of effective feedback mechanisms to prompt course corrections. And I mean, Zafiris mentioned that I worked in NGOs for about 10 years, a lot of it during this time. And so there's a lot of war stories about things going wrong. So let's pick a couple of examples. So in Jordan, a large youth employment program was found to have very little impact, basically because the government had pushed the implementers of the program to target low-skilled at-risk youth, which was a group for whom the program was not designed. It was actually designed for more skilled youth. And so the young people didn't really have the capacity to benefit from what the program was offering. But this was a political consideration because the government found that they wanted to focus on this segment. In 2014, the Tunisian Ministry of Vocational Training and Employment developed a youth employment program called Fursati. 2 weeks after drafting a sound implementation plan for this program that took into account known capacity constraints and planned for kind of a slow evolution of the program, the minister announced the launch of a full-blown program that the country was not able to support. And obviously that unsurprisingly failed to deliver on the results. So these are some of these issues. Another issue is not linking educations and skills training to policies that support job creation. So improving education, like we were discussing throughout the past couple of days, without creating jobs simply leads to educated youth who are unemployed. In Tunisia, for example, in 2013, unemployment rates among university graduates reached about 68%. So the country was investing a lot in education, but the jobs didn't exist. And we see this throughout the region. Another region that had high youth unemployment rates includes Central Asia and other parts of Eastern Europe. And they developed programs and policies and strategies, just like the Middle East did. What they did, however, was also develop implementation plans. They actually said, okay, how do we put these into practice? The region in the Middle East do not do implementation plans. We put together very nice looking national policies and strategies, and then nothing much gets done. So, I mean, all these indicate that really we're talking about failure of governments, and currently the situation in the region today is even further exacerbated by other global trends, including the COVID pandemic, as well as the disruptive evolution of ICT advances that we're discussing. So, okay, applying these observations to our discussions of the ICT situation and the new industrial revolution. So based on our experience with how the countries of the region handled the demographic transition, I'm not that sure that we can handle as a region the new industrial revolution and the changes required. Countries of the region, international organizations, donors all know that this is a big issue, and they're investing in research, and they're investing in conferences, and they're investing in all kinds of things to raise the issues about what can be done. And this is one of them. The problem we're facing again is the issue of what can be done. And the previous session mentioned that the difficult political economy situations, the difficult in figuring out what needs to be done and implementing it as being a main obstacle. And then we really avoid a discussion about really how we can navigate those implementation problems. So thinking about a little bit what needs to be done within the context of the new industrial revolution, a lot of the issues are the same. We need to transform education systems to focus on skills development, including both technical and soft skills, which can complement these emerging technologies. But again, education reform is very difficult, and it's difficult also when you still have a public sector that dominates the labor market. We need to allow the private sector develop and grow and be able to absorb new technologies and accept a measure of disruption to its economies, which new technologies afford. But we know from the past 20 years of experience is that the private sector is severely regulated and is prevented from really growing and doing what it needs to do, both to absorb young people as well as to absorb disruptive technologies. Now, a lot of the action happens in the informal sector, and the gig economy is mentioned. And this is not a solution, because what we want is quality jobs, and that requires sound policy. Finally, we need to reduce the incentives to kind of think about the social contract and allow greater private initiative, and reduce our reliance on public sector employment. All these are similar to the changes that needed to happen with regard to the demographic wave that Raghi introduced. So rather than actually heading toward these changes, what we're actually seeing is the region heading in the opposite direction. Am I running out of time, Zafiris? Okay. So we're heading in the opposite direction. So countries that should be at the forefront of preparing for this new world of work are increasingly struggling politically and economically. These include Lebanon, Jordan, and Tunisia. So these really should be at the forefront. These should be leading the way and showing the path. And if these countries are struggling, what does it mean for the rest of us? Gulf countries have achieved quite a bit in terms of private sector development, but they're actually lagging behind in terms of educational quality and outcomes and economic diversification efforts. And the clock is ticking because we're expecting lower global demand for oil and the emergence of new technologies to replace them. Countries such as Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq are still struggling with internal conflict and social unrest, and other countries are at the edge of potentially suffering from broken social contracts and heading towards the same fate. So the region actually is facing additional challenges that are preventing it from addressing these key issues. And time is not on our side. Ragi already pointed to a second youth bulge that is expected to enter affect the region within the coming 10 years. This represents actually a second chance. So if countries of the region are able to really make the policy changes that are necessary, they can take advantage of the second chance at a demographic dividend. At the same time as addressing the needs of the new industrial revolution and incorporating, allowing their economies to better incorporate ICT technologies, AI, and digitalization. The big question that we have before us is, are there ways for them to overcome the obstacles implementation that they faced the first time around? And I think what we can do is discuss some of these possibilities in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nader. And indeed, as you mentioned, we've tried everything in terms of youth initiatives, and your experience as director of research at Silatec has given you great insights. Yeah, your conclusion at the end was that we're talking about failure of governance, and combined with what Ragi said, that yes, we are dealing with more educated youth and people now, increasingly educated economies, but the jobs are not forthcoming. I very much welcome your references to the GCC, the Gulf countries, and Syria, and especially Jordan. And our next speaker, Caroline, is an expert on Jordan labor market issues. Let me turn to her now. And I just realized that we have the two men first and the two ladies second, which I didn't pay much attention, I must say. But perhaps the best things come last. So Caroline, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zafiris. Of course, the best things come last. So I'm Dr. Carolyn Kraft. It's morning here in Minnesota. I'm based in Minnesota. I'm an associate professor at St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I have a number of different projects and research work going on in the Middle East and North Africa, looking primarily at labor, education, health, and inequality issues, projects on refugees, labor market dynamics, life course transitions, human capital, fertility, very relevant for today, and also the impact of COVID-19, both on academics and on the labor market. So lots of ongoing work that you'll hear referenced as I discuss today. And I want to thank ERF for inviting me to be part of this important discussion on demography and labor markets. We're trying to talk about the future, to predict the future even, which is very challenging. We would not have 2 years ago predicted our new COVID-19 era. But when we're talking about demography, we do know a bit about the future. We have data on fertility trends and also fertility intentions that can help us understand some key population trends. So that's where I'll sort of start my remarks, thinking about the fertility rate and what's going on. So globally, the total fertility rate, the TFR, declines to near replacement levels as countries undertake and then complete their demographic transition. So that's the idea of a demographic transition. You have this shift from sort of a high fertility, high mortality down to a lower fertility replacement level fertility as mortality declines. So that's what happens globally when the transition goes on. But what do we know about fertility trends in the Middle East and North Africa and the MENA region? There are some countries that have fertility rates near replacement levels. There are countries that are around 2 births per woman, and that have been at that point for some time, particularly in the Gulf, but also Tunisia, although there's been a slight increase. So there are a number of MENA countries who kind of completed the transition. However, the TFR in a number of other countries in the region has stagnated, stalled, and even increased. As Ragi alluded to earlier, Egypt had an increase, and some other countries have as well. So most of the countries are in a stall or increases, and the only mid-transition countries not experiencing a fertility stall are Syria, Yemen, and Palestine. So they're continuing on their transition. But the countries with stalls and reversals include Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Morocco, and Oman. So this trend of stalls has occurred in these sort of middle income, lower middle income countries in a regional context of substantial economic and political instability, which may itself affect fertility rates and create something of a feedback loop, including the occurrence of stalls. So that's the trends we've been seeing. That's what we've sort of seen to date. And that has a lot of implications for what we're going to see in terms of, in Egypt, the echo of the youth bulge, just ongoing pressures on the labor market in a number of countries as these children are born and move through the education system and into the labor market. Now, we can even look a little further in the future. There's no crystal ball for future fertility, but as well as looking at the past to kind of predict the future, we do have data on fertility intentions. So how many children do women want to have? And their answers also suggest ongoing demographic pressure. Ideal family sizes have changed very little in the region recently. And in fact, they've changed less than observed family sizes, which means that we may see upcoming reversals again and catch up fertility. So in countries such as Jordan, the modal ideal family size remains 4 children, with only small shifts over time. So this population growth and the demographic drivers of the future of work are determined by these fertility rates. So the fertility stalls and the persistently high ideal family sizes mean there's ongoing demographic pressure, first on the health system, then the education system, and ultimately the labor market as these cohorts are born and move onward. Now, one important point that hasn't been raised yet about the future of work in the region is that fertility trends imply the future of work includes a lot of care work, both substantial caregiving responsibilities that disproportionately fall on women and employment in the care economy for folks like midwives and teachers. So that's an important aspect of the future of work and perhaps an opportunity in terms of creating some decent work in those type of employment situations. Now, a challenging issue here in the care economy is that investing in the quality of care is really critically important. Early childhood development, as was discussed in the skills panel yesterday, is the most sensitive developmental phase, but improving the quality of care and education is really challenging when the quantity has to rise at the same time. You have all these quantity pressures needing to build new schools, needing to build new healthcare facilities, and then investing in quality gets even more difficult. So that is currently one of the major challenges. And it becomes then a labor force challenge. So one of the questions we were asked to discuss is the labor market prepared to absorb the incoming labor force? And I'm particularly interested in this word choice of absorb. I'm going to make a real distinction between labor absorption and creating decent jobs. And also there's some really important gender dynamics that happen around job creation and labor absorption. So the region has for some time been stuck in a really labor absorption paradigm. Demographic pressures, a huge number of jobs need to be created each year to employ new entrants, those youth in MENA. And even prior to COVID-19, countries were struggling to create good jobs. Efforts at structural reform, right-sizing the public sector, shrunk the pool of good jobs, primarily formal jobs. And the public sector, as it shrank, that space was filled primarily by informal employment. So without social protection, not formal private sector employment. So at that point, young men faced the choice between queuing, so waiting in unemployment trying to get a decent job, for increasingly limited formal employment opportunities. So they faced that option, queuing, or accepting the more readily available informal jobs. Young women who are not as normatively obliged to work and who have substantial reservation working conditions that are not usually met by the informal sector, increasingly chose between queuing for the limited pool of acceptable jobs, leading to high female unemployment rates, or remaining outside the labor force. And that we've seen has become increasingly common as employment rates for women and female labor force participation have fallen. So the employment growth was largely informal, largely low productivity jobs, and it's really just tracked the growth in the working age population, or not even kept up with it in some cases, absorbing the incoming labor force, but not creating good jobs, not absorbing them into high quality or high productivity jobs. And this is a paradigm that is going to remain challenging with additional pressures, fertility trends, and ongoing labor abundance to sort of reinforce this labor absorption paradigm. Now, the fertility trends and labor absorbing paradigm also interact with gender norms in ways that are self-reinforcing as well. So social norms around a male breadwinner, female homemaker paradigm place substantial care work responsibilities on women. Historically, a key component of the demographic transition globally has been economic shifts, particularly economic growth, creating employment opportunities and raising the opportunity cost of time and thus care work and childbearing for women. So there's been this pull from the labor market, and that's been an important part of the demographic transition. Yet, despite rising educational attainment, in MENA, we see women are actually having these decreased participation and employment rates, and that's because the pull of the labor market is getting weaker, not stronger for women because of those limited opportunities for good jobs. So we've seen this female labor force participation and female employment remaining stagnant or even falling. So the limited and even diminishing opportunities that are reconcilable with gender norms and reservation working conditions for women are a real challenge. And there also are strong norms in the region that when jobs are scarce, men should have the priority. A challenge that becomes even more acute, I would note, with COVID-19. And also notably, MENA is the one region of the world where we are not seeing gender norms change across generations. Norms remain persistently inequitable among young people as in the older generation. So we end up in a situation with limited employment opportunities for women, a relatively lower opportunity cost of childbearing. And that may even lead to a feedback loop that keeps fertility rates high and continues to place labor supply pressure for some time. And patterns of both observed fertility and fertility intentions show an interesting recent dynamic around this. They show the breakdown of the historical education-fertility relationship in the region. Historically, more educated women worked and wanted fewer children. But as women have had fewer employment opportunities over time, fertility rates are now converging across education levels in countries such as Egypt and Jordan. There's no longer this differential. Likewise, fertility intentions are also converging, how many kids folks want to have. In Jordan, the ideal number of children as of 2017 was at or above 3.4 children on average for all age groups and all education levels. There really wasn't much differentiation. So weak labor demand thus actually can contribute to ongoing increases in fertility and labor supply, which is a challenging feedback loop. So far with this discussion of fertility, I've focused on the quantity of labor supply, but what about its quality? That's the skills question. What about skills? So one school of thought had emphasized the skills mismatch as a key component for poor labor market outcomes in the region. Yet there's generally very weak demand for skills. And indeed, there's actually a lot of evidence that youth are at least overeducated. It's hard to measure overskilled, but overeducated relative to the requirements of their jobs. So we've already alluded to this a few times, but the reason for this is that we remain stuck in a credentialist equilibrium. So countries tend to have this strong demand for credentials from the public sector and weak demand for skills from the private or the public sector, right? So the labor demand is not sending strong signals to acquire skills. So it's not just a labor supply issue, it's the signals coming from the labor demand side. So youth and their families, knowing that credentials are what is valued in the labor market, that's what they demand, and that's what the education system delivers. Credentials, certificates, degrees, rather than skills. Weak skills are manifested in the poor performance by MENA students on international assessments. And interestingly, MENA also has a reverse gender gap. Young women are obtaining more education increasingly and performing better on international assessments than young men, despite the fact that we are increasingly seeing young women out of the labor force. And one interesting feature of MENA's learning poverty is that it is worst earliest in early grade skills like basic reading, basic numeracy. The gap with other countries closes a bit, still remains large, but it closes a bit in later grades. So this suggests to me that foundational skills, we're talking about like basic numeracy and literacy, are actually a key barrier to building those higher order skills. And although demand for skills may be weak, investing in numeracy and literacy really can help support the acquisition of skills later on, maybe on the job rather, or in the workplace. One other point on basic skills is that MENA countries should perhaps be investing more in physical fitness. This is actually the most commonly required job skill currently. And if we take the present as sort of a signal of future trends, physical fitness is the most common job skill required. And growth in sectors such as construction suggests this may continue for some time. So this may be an important skill for the future of work as well. Now, MENA has been stuck in a credentialist equilibrium for some time, and the ongoing demographic pressure on the school system and labor market makes shifts more difficult. And a point that's been raised is the region also has really weak information systems and limited capacity in educational institutions to really pivot and deliver specific skills as they may be needed in the labor market. Vocational education, for example, often trains on outdated techniques or equipment. So focusing on delivering high quality fundamental basic skills may be thus the best strategy for preparing for the future of work, given some of the sort of constraints on capacity to do otherwise. But one point I want to raise in addition on the nature of work relates to skills and digitization. So there's new ERF data, the COVID-19 MENA monitor data, that are focused on showing the impact of COVID-19 on labor markets, but also have some nice insights into understanding current challenges and even the future of work. So even in the midst of the pandemic, the ability to work from home was rare for wage workers in general. Only 14 to 22% across countries were able to work from home. And the reason those who could not work from home were unable to do so was most commonly that it was not possible to do their job at home. They worked in a shop, they had to be at the shop. So that was 66 to 90% across countries, followed by not being allowed, 7 to 32% across countries. Lack of technology or connectivity were reasons for only 2% of individuals. So although there is a lot of discussion around the world about the future of work being anywhere, being remote, the nature of work in MENA really would need to shift before remote work and those digital corresponding skills become a key component of the future of work. So in the face of these challenges of ongoing demographic pressure on labor supply, barriers to participation for women, and weak skills, both demanded and supplied, what can the region do to start creating an abundance of high quality jobs and strong labor demand? Would that there were a simple or easy answer, but I'll make my final remarks a few key points on just a few thoughts about these issues on the labor demand and labor supply sides of the market. Addressing weak labor demand in the region is difficult, but it is at the root of a lot of the challenges we face. And we face a shortage of data on firms. It's a key constraint on what we know. But what we do know about firms in the region underlines two key points: weak dynamics and weak competition. Those contribute to weak labor demand, limited job creation. The firms that are creating jobs in the region are not more productive. The type of career destruction we would like to see, where less productive firms close and more productive firms grow or form, is largely absent. And barriers to entry and cost of formalization are one potential reason for those challenges. Countries in the region are making some efforts to, for example, simplify business registration, but more work is definitely needed. Closely related are the studies that identify politically connected firms, often referred to as crony capitalism, is a barrier to job creation. Energy subsidies, regulatory capture, preferential access to credit, privatization capture, and selective trade protectionism for politically connected firms are all dynamics that create unfair competition that we've shown reduces job creation. So a more competitive firm landscape is very politically challenging, but would be more conducive to robust future job creation and that labor demand. On the labor supply side, I'm going to put in another plug for investing in early childhood development, where MENA does lag behind the world. And key numeracy and literacy, those early grade skills, can at least set up labor supply to be more successful in whatever labor demand the future may bring. Investing in this area and also the care economy can at the same time help create labor demand for women, as well as early childhood care supporting women's ability to reconcile employment and family formation. So there's some positive synergies there. So I'll stop here, but thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Caroline. You really added a lot of things here, and you supplemented, expanded, complemented what the previous speakers have said. Of course, they have written a lot and they have said a lot about the lack of competition, barriers to entry, connected firms, WASTA, crony capitalism, and the like. But you really sum it up very well. Also, you expanded, you told us about the GCC and the differences within the Arab region and the diversity of the region. I like what you said about the very modest remark that you don't have a crystal ball. And of course, I mean, in economics, we say that economic forecasts are very dangerous, especially about the future. But I like very much your comments and in what the previous speakers referred to as the pattern of growth, not just growth. And you enriched it by mentioning the care economy and the impact, the early childhood development, the gender dimension. And you went all the way to the physical fitness, how important this is in the new world. Plus, you refer to the digitalization and also the effects of the COVID. Wow, that's very good. It's good you are coming later into this panel. And I think it will be even better now that we turn to Ghada. And Ghada, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Zefiris. Let me start by introducing myself as per your request. My name is Ghada Barsoum. I am currently serving as the chair of the Public Policy and Administration Department. I'm an associate professor at the American University in Cairo. I do research on issues of social policy, higher education policy, and employment. I had the privilege of writing in 2007. Nader mentioned this and Raghi mentioned this. We're talking about the youth bulge, the upcoming youth bulge, and we used the term tsunami at the time. Writing as part of the Wolfenson Center initiative about youth. So this a little bit sounds like a deja vu for me. We're going back to discussing the youth bulge and demographic challenge. And I'd like to think a little bit about that. We worried about the youth bulge. We worried about, and we engage in this discussion and endless debate whether this is going to be a window of opportunity or a curse. And so you get people debating all the time whether the population growth would be this or that. And now we're worried about the echo of the bulge. We're worried about the children of the bulge. And it's ironic if your parents are part of a youth bulge with condensed opportunities that you are part of a generation that goes to very condensed schools because of the pressure that there's so many of you at the same time, and then you face a labor market with that is highly competitive. So yes, we need to worry about the echo of the bulge. And Raghi starts by saying, I mean, I would, if I would prepare this from the beginning, if I'm the only speaker, I would go read what Raghi and Karen have produced about the dates and what we expect. And 2025 is pretty soon for any policymaker to cannot really brush that date off. If we're going to start to see the echo of the bulge starting from 2025, there is big urgency. in talking about preparing for this this expanded cohort of entrants to the labor market. And let's remember that we did not do well in the first time. I mean, the region has witnessed political upheavals. Many researchers connected the political upheavals to the demographic profile at the time, increased urbanization, increased education, and all the components seem to still exist. And let's remember that the increase in the supply of labor from the new entrants is likely to depress wages and to lead to dissatisfaction. So it's not something that we could brush off and say, you know what, we're fine. Let's not worry about it. No, I think that the issue of demography is central to the region and will continue to be so for quite some time. And we talk about the youth bulge as demography, and it's not just the youth. We need to stop here for a second. Demography, there are three variables to demography. There is fertility, and Carolyn did a fantastic job and her researches, and she and Raghi, they've done fantastic research on this, on fertility. But we also have longevity. We have the old bulge we talked about. We have large generations of workers without access to social protection. And we know that in the Arab region, 1 in 3 people have access to contributory social insurance schemes, which means that when they reach the age of 60 or 65, which is now in most countries, the retirement age, many of them will not have access to pension schemes, which would mean that they will stay longer in the labor market, further crowding the market along with the large cohort of new entrants. So competition would further depress the wages in the labor market. You have not just the new bulge, the echo of the bulge, but you have the bulge and maybe the older generation of before the bulge. And the third variable in demography is migration. And lower and middle income countries in the region have long benefited from remittances, sending unskilled workers to oil-rich countries, and these will bring in remittances. This scenario is not continuing, and that's another reality that demography imposes, which is due to the third variable of migration. It's very likely that those with low skills or no skills will not have a place to migrate to. And more so, we need to have maybe a fresh look at migration in view of advanced technology. And I'm going to discuss the issue of advanced technology over and over. It seems, although I haven't done a lot of research on advanced technology and its impact, as I think of the future of work, I think the issue of technology will always be at the back of our mind. So advanced technology might mean that some of these skilled laborers might be at home in their home countries, but their brains and their times are serving other contexts, which would create a new dynamic that we are not really prepared for. So it might be just the migration of labor time, not physical migration of labor that we could see in the future. And it's a very interesting dynamic that we need to be thinking about further. So I talked about the three variables in demographic transition. And I think, Raghi, Nader, and Carolyn, they did a great job talking about fertility. And I think we need to really think more about longevity and those who are going to stay longer in the labor market for lack of access to social insurance, and those who are going to stay because there's nowhere else to go because of constraints on migration. So where do we go with this? And I keep thinking the only way to go is skill building. And it's skill building that goes beyond credentials. It's learning, not just credentials. And Raghi and I and Carolyn, we've written a lot about this fetishism, our credential fetishism in this region. Everybody wants a degree. I mean, I've interviewed young people who would say, just get a degree and put it on the wall in your living room, and that's it. I've spoken to people, men, who would say a degree is needed to be a shahadat gawaz, just to have a degree, to have the social status of a degree, but not the learning. So what we're talking about now, it's going to be a serious look at education. What is education doing? What is education? What are the outcomes of education? And I know this is not a session about education, but you cannot talk about demography without thinking about building the skills for this upcoming generation of new entrants to the labor market. So the future of work is often about fear about job loss due to technology. And the way I see it, that perhaps technology is the hope for skill building. So generation after generation, learning outcomes have been tied to the local school in the village where you live, where you're brought up. And this can be changed. And this is what I believe in. If only we can harness the internet access for skill building, if only we can use social media to exchange videos of technical skills as opposed to songs or pranks or even hate videos, if only that we have enough materials in Arabic where, because there is a serious language barrier for internet users to benefit from the skill building potentials of the internet. If only we can have that, if only we can harness technology to serve us in skill building in this region, this is what is really important for the region, for this new bulge, or for the echo of the bulge to thrive and to find jobs. And I really wanted to think more about this whole issue of skill mismatch and skill building. What has been happening is that in many contexts in the region, we have low productivities. We have sectors of low productivities throughout the economy. And in a sense, it's more of a vicious circle. When there is not enough demand for skilled work, the education system and the young people would get the message that there's no need to build a skill. Why would I learn robotics if there are no factories around me that would use robotics? Why would I learn anything that's highly technical if there's no need for that? So it becomes more of a vicious circle. You have low productivity economic activities, and these would would inhibit the need for skills. And at the end, people would just go study, seek credentials or go study things that are not highly technical. And then you have low unskilled labor in the labor market. So it becomes more of a self-perpetuating cycle. And then when you get this odd sector seeking highly skilled labor, they face labor shortages, and you start to talk about skill mismatch and not having enough skilled labor. But because it's the whole cycle of the economy that did not really encourage skill building. So I really am very keen on this issue of skill building because I see this as the only hope. I see that harnessing technology to build skills as the only hope for this large echo of the youth bulge to thrive and to find potentials, not just within the boundaries of their countries, but to work to work in different contexts, further harnessing technology. So while people are talking about technology as the fear, as the potential loss of jobs, we can think of technology maybe as the hope for these young people to learn and to find opportunities beyond their physical environment. Now, let me go to one issue that I've done research on, which is active labor market policies, because, a lot of people would say, okay, we have so many young people, let's do youth employment programs. And neither talked about this, neither talked about a couple of initiatives that went wrong. I've done the tally. I was fortunate enough to work with the ILO Geneva to do a tally of youth employment programs in the region. And there, hundreds of programs. We could count, more than, hundreds, a couple of hundred programs that we could count. And it sounds fantastic. The problem is all of these programs most of them are in pilot phase. Most of them have very low outreach. Most of them have very little documentation of their activities, and almost all of them have no monitoring and evaluation system. So we don't really know whether they work. And not only that, active labor market policies take a very minuscule percentage of GDP in most countries in the region. So there is little investment in these programs, although you see so many of them. So it's more of a very conundrum where you have large number of programs, but they're very ineffective, very small, and they're run by small NGOs. And at the end, they have very limited outcome. And of course, we have very weak evidence base about how these programs work. So I am focused on skill building, and that's on the supply of labor. On the demand side, there is no way for this region to have enough jobs for these upcoming entrance to the labor market unless their economies are further diversified. Carolyn talked about the care economy, and there is significant, there's huge need for services in the care economy. There is little investment in that. There, large population would need to eat, and there's little investment in agribusiness and little investment in green jobs. There is need for investment in healthcare. These packages of investment that should go into sectors that would be most tied to the needs of the new cohort, we need to invest further in these sectors. Let me conclude by saying that, the future of work is definitely one of an increased supply of labor, pressure of demographics, and that although the first bulge did not pass, has passed, it did not pass peacefully. We have to worry about the upcoming bulge, and we have to really think seriously about it. And again, I would focus on investment in skill building for this youth, for this upcoming bulge to be an economic dividend. And again, I would conclude by saying that digitalization and technology might be seen as a challenge to work, but it's actually a hope for skill building in the region, for a borderless domain of knowledge. And thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nada. That was a fantastic conclusion of what we have covered. Another modest presentation after Caroline. I mean, half of what you said was with reference to Raghi, Nada, and Caroline, and of course to your work. But that was a very nice way to conclude. Of course, you added a lot of things. For example, we have been talking about demography, and you are the first one to mention urbanization. You mentioned the migration and the remittances. And above all, you are the first one to mention wages. And from an economic perspective, the labor market at the end is determined by wages, which is the incentive for the labor, for job seekers to come in, and the cost to the employers. So it's a very nice conclusion of what we've been saying. I fully agree, and I think others will do so, about your emphasis on skills building, and also your qualification that it may not need to job with education, is at least we will not end up with a brain in the drain, and we will have brain drain. And most of the panelists are migrants themselves. So I think these are very important dimensions. So yes, you were rather pessimistic on your conclusion that there is no way that we can realistically expect a turnaround in the creation of jobs, and especially better jobs. And you echoed Nada's comment about the failure of youth programs, and we had many of them. And in fact, active labor market programs are sectoral programs, while, as everybody else, and you said, we are dealing with a systemic problem here, which is on the labor demand side mainly. So I think we had an extremely rich discussion, and I've seen some comments flashing on my screen, but also the machine tells me that only the host and the panelists have access to the questions and comments. So I'm in no position to mention or select any of the comments. So perhaps Ramaj or you can have a look at the questions and answer something from them, and then we can answer one question is, and then each one can summarize at the end within 2-3 minutes whatever we have been discussing. How would you like to go about? Do you have access to the comments? Perhaps the panelists do have access to the comments.
There is a comment by Ibrahim Awad who'd like to make a to make it verbally, so maybe we should hear from him.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I'm sorry I don't have access to that. I should have worked out this before. Yes.
Look at the chat.
Ibrahim, are you online? Ibrahim, are you online? Hello? Dr. Ibrahim? Raghi, can you see him?
I think someone needs to unmute him.
Ah. Yes, he is. Perhaps we can move to something else he can join, or somebody can send him a message to unmute.
No.
We can proceed with something else, and then he can come back later.
Ibrahim's comment was about the opportunities to digitally work for external labor markets while staying in the region, staying at home, kind of using these employment platforms as a way of obtaining work elsewhere. So maybe we can address that while Ibrahim tries to come on.
He says I cannot unmute myself. Yes, he's my generation, so I mean I understand that.
Ramaj needs to unmute him.
Yeah, I think he cannot because the system is set this way.
Okay, I mean perhaps we can address the point. For example, Mauritius has a part of Mauritius was in the call centers. They can speak French and they can speak English, and of course, many of them are of Indian descent. Of course, in India we have Chennai, a lot of call centers that. Once I got upset, I mean, with the call center, they told me I'm in India, and I was in Washington at the time. So he told me there's no point in shouting at me. So, any question? Any views from the panelists on that?
Okay.
I mean, go ahead.
No, there's one. Ramaj says they will promote him, so maybe.
I can now he's able to talk, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramaj, and thank you, Shireen. I would just like to comment on what Ghada said, because Ghada said something extremely important, on which we are working at Nomad. I don't know if you are aware of what Nomad is. Nomad is the global partnership, knowledge partnership on migration and development, which is hosted by the World Bank. And I'm the chair of the thematic working group on labor migration in Nomad. And we are working, one of the subjects that we are working on is precisely what Ghada said, which is migration, digital migration, but not migration in the sense of the migration of the ICT engineers or specialists, but it is digital migration. You are in your country, you are working for external labor markets. You are an engineer, you are a chartered accountant, you are a lawyer, and you are working for external labor markets. So you are migrating, in fact, and you are depriving of your domestic labor market of your skills. So in a way, this keeps the any transformation, any economic transformation from happening, and impedes raising productivity and raising the skill content of the domestic economy. So I was just very glad that Ghada raised this point on which we are working. I have, in addition to this, I have just one sort of political economy observation on skill building or skill development, and as Ghada said, but also as Caroline said, skill demand is extremely important, because without skill demand, you will not have the constituency that supports the allocation of funds for skill development policies. So in fact, one of the causes of deficient skill development is that there is no demand for skills, in fact, in the economy. So you need to create this constituency. So it is a really political process that has to be taken into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And this rhymes with what Caroline said about the difference between absorption and decent job creation. The issue is whether these still working workers will have access, to benefits, to a pension. This is what Nada also mentioned. But Caroline wanted to say something on exactly this issue before you want to take it up.
Sure, or Gada can take it up as well. But I think one of the points to make, and it maybe a little bit addresses the next question, the Q&A too, is the digital sector, like call centers, right? This does exist in MENA. There are a growing call center sector, but it is very small. And to the interesting point on sort of outsourcing, therefore being a different kind of brain drain, one of the newer models is sort of global skills partnerships. I'll put a link in the chat in a second, but the idea is that countries can actually do training for particular needs. Nursing is a really classic example, right? So, Europe collaborates, the UK collaborates with Egypt to do nursing training in Egypt, trains some nurses who stay in Egypt and some nurses who go elsewhere. Like, that's an interesting model because it helps reduce some of the sort of brain drain issues while still creating some of those pathways for skilled migration and actually making sure the skills are what's needed as well. So I'll put the link in on that.
Zefiris, can I add something?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Indeed.
So Ibrahim's point is very well taken. And there's a couple of dimensions that we probably need to mention as well. And besides some of the issues that were mentioned yesterday in terms of access to broadband and access to internet, you also need proper infrastructure. You need electricity to be working properly. Many of the areas where you have good access to internet bandwidth and other are in urban areas, not in peripheries and rural areas. So you have some inequality of access, not just between countries, within countries. The issues of skills also comes up here. I had a chance to look at some data from Odesk before it became Upwork, and on coders in Palestine. And the issue wasn't so much the technical skills; those were pretty good. The issue was some of the soft skills, their ability to respond, timeliness, just dealing with customers. So again, you come to the issue of skills. So there's a lot of things that go into, and the final point is actually also payment gateways. Be able to actually get payments. Not all countries have that ability. So it holds a lot of promise, but you need a lot more infrastructure. You need skills development. You need all the things we talked about to make this work properly.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this issue as well.
Yes, I was going to come to you, Raghi. Yes. Please go ahead.
So I think, I'm generally quite positive on the idea of digital migration and the ability to basically sell your skills to an external market without having to move there. I think that's one of the promises that digital technology has made available. However, it seems to me that if we're talking about demand for skills, that's a very good way of internationalizing demand for skills. But the question is, do you do this as an individual who goes onto one of these international platforms and tries to fight your way through it and be able to develop the skills where you can market your own skills on these platforms? Or is it organized as an industry, like the way it was done in India, where you have entrepreneurs organizing an industry around exporting these services and therefore being very competitive on the world level and generating the environment and context in which people who don't have very many skills to start with can participate in these industries? I think that's a big question that needs to be asked. I do believe that going in an industry framework as opposed to an individual trying to fight their way through these existing platforms is probably the most promising route. Now, when we do look though at the data on this, how this industry is spreading in the region, this global business process outsourcing industry, well, we find that many countries in the region are quite competitive in terms of cost. In fact, very competitive in terms of cost. They're actually middling in terms of skills, that the skills are available and they tend to rank well in global indices and stuff like that in terms of skills, but they rank terribly in terms of business environment and the willingness of foreign investors to come and invest and to kind of get into these industries. And I think that's the governance issues that Nader talked about earlier is really getting in the way for many of these industries. And to add to that, the political instability, you add to that the cronyism and the closed business environment from a cronyism point of view, and you add to that security issues and conflicts and all that that's creating. So I think that there is potential there. However, I think there's also a potential threat. This is kind of the indirect effect of automation that I talked about earlier, that a lot of these processes in many rich countries are now being automated rather than outsourced. And so there is a direction towards automation of a lot of these services, especially the more routine ones, so that provides fewer opportunities for outsourcing to the less developed countries. And that I think is more the indirect effect of automation on demand for skills on these information services in the developing countries.
Yes, indeed, there are all these things, and I mean, also the thing that Nader mentioned, the electricity supply. For example, if you take the Middle East, take Palestine, take Lebanon, take Iraq, take Yemen, with the exception of Jordan, I mean, no other country has reliable electricity, and I don't know the situation with respect to internet connectivity. We are already 1.5 hours in this session, which is thoroughly enjoyable, and I think we can spend another hour. But perhaps at this point, I can ask each of the panelists if they have seen a question, I mean, that they want to answer, feel free to address it, or you can give us your final thoughts after we have said and we have discussed all these things. So Raghi, since you are there, I mean, if there were one or two things to say, if not three, in terms of a policy perspective.
Well, I mean, I think that to bring back demography, I mean, demography has forced us to worry about quantity over quality over the past 20, 30 years, and will probably force us to worry about quantity over quality again over the next 20 years in terms of both the number of jobs available, the number of seats in universities and schools, the number of children that can be educated. And that's the curse of demography in some sense, where we now really need to focus on quality, both quality of education and skill building and quality of jobs in the labor market, and the nature of job creation and labor demand in terms of quality. And this is really where demography has been our curse to some extent, getting in the way of this transition from quantity to quality. And unfortunately, while we have a very short window now where we can look at quality when labor supply pressures are weaker, labor supply pressure are going to come back with a vengeance, where quantity is going to be, again, mainly on the agenda. But there is a chance that in about 5 years, the number of children will go down significantly, because now some of the fertility declines will have, that baby boom will be behind us. And so I think we do have a chance to focus on quality of education, especially early childhood and basic foundational skills that Carolyn mentioned. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can see a silver lining there.
Thanks very much. Yes, indeed, the waves are coming and going with this, with the fertility. Unfortunately, we have the waves from COVID now, and we don't know how the two waves will interact and what they will create. Let me go in the order that we had the presentation. So Nader, I mean, what would you like to say on this? I'm burning to ask you, since you have been at the center of it and Silatech with the youth and all the programs, if you were today in Silatech, what would you do differently or more of what you did? But feel free to say whatever you'd like to say.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Silatech is a foundation or nonprofit organization based in Doha that focuses on trying to create, connect young people to economic opportunities, jobs, and resources and assets to start a business. And I think it's another one of those cases where, you know, there was a lot of learning that took place in the first 8-9 years, and I think we really identified when I was there, some areas that worked, including digital platforms, and learning how to really unlock access to finance for young entrepreneurs. I mean, there was a couple of key areas where you made progress. And then what happened was, all those are based on kind of a theory of change. Management changed, the theories of change went out the window, and instead of really approaching it from a very grassroots, evidence-based, thinking through how things work, it became more of a duplication thing, where I think the impact, even though the headlines, the impact was, we're going to do much more with less. The reality was the organization did a lot less with actually less. So it's another one of those cases, I think, where I mean, I can go into details, but governance was a big issue. I think I'd like to leave just with one issue that we didn't really discuss, and it comes to the way this dialogue is framed, which I think is actually quite powerful, which is thinking about narratives. And one thing that struck me over the past 10 years during the Arab Spring and going forward is we know a lot of the details, but I haven't seen an alternative narrative emerge. We know what needs to be done. We know that we need to focus on skills. We know that we need to focus on better jobs. We need to focus on technology. Some of the comments right now are asking about how these aspirations conflict with the realities. And this is what this panel is about. The realities that we're facing over the next 10 years clash with what the aspirations are of what we want to see happen. And what we desperately need in this region is kind of a different narrative. How do we incorporate issues of political economy? How do we incorporate the issues of the gender dynamics and the choices women are making, young women are making in terms of participating or not participating? How do we incorporate the issue of the realities of crony capitalism and corruption and other aspects in a way that could identify at a high level kind of a way forward? And that's something I think that's missing in the region, kind of a development paradigm, an articulation of, okay, what can we do differently in terms of simply a roadmap? Right now we talk about the details, but there's no compass that I see that has emerged from our conversations, and we need that desperately as a region. So that's a thought I would like to leave with. Thank you.
Which is a good thought, actually. Yeah, I mean, if the economy is not growing, I mean, China created the middle class because it was growing very fast, and in the Arab region that had the middle class aspirations now have fallen behind the economic situation in the region. But we're running out of time, and I think there was a specific question that came. I don't know whether you saw it flashing on the screen, but until we address that, if we do, let me turn to Caroline.
Sure, thank you. And I'll try actually to address together two of the questions in the Q&A and then give a final thought. So the questions that are open relate to sort of technological change and can it be a game changer, or maybe the other way around, does demography sort of prevent technological change? And I'd emphasize more that the current structure of the economy in most countries really prevents technology from being a game changer as a key issue, right? Primarily micro enterprises, primarily trade and retail in a lot of countries. So until we see some of that economic transformation, you could end up in some kind of virtuous feedback loop if we can get some of that dynamism and competition and then latch on to some of the digital technologies. But I think it's going to be challenging when you're talking about sort of the current structure of the economy for digital technology to be a game changer, just given what we have. So until some of that dynamism happens, I don't think you're going to get some of the sort of virtuous feedback of technology then accelerating productivity. The other point I will end with is sort of thinking about Nader's point, what's the roadmap? It is interesting to think about, not in every respect, but at least in the demography respect, how Tunisia had a bit of a different story in terms of fertility, right? It was, I talked about sort of the Gulf and Tunisia have lower fertility rates. and sort of women's rights, employment opportunities for women, the health system, like what is it that allowed Tunisia to switch from a sort of child quantity paradigm to more of a child quality paradigm and reduce some of those demographic pressures? Now, that has not solved Tunisia's problems. It still has huge problems sort of in terms of unemployment and creating good jobs, but that is an interesting lesson to try to learn from in terms of shifting at least the fertility side of things. So I'll end with that.
Good, thank you. And yeah, now let me now turn to Gada. Gada, you have the final word, which can be more than one word.
Thank you, Seferis. That's really a privilege. Thank you so much. I think I will start by saying that demographic momentum is irreversible. It's inevitable. And you cannot cheat the numbers. This is it. The bulge echo is coming. And again, we did not do well with when the first youth bulge came. So I think it's time that we do it right this time, or it's going to be very expensive. And Nader talks about a roadmap or a compass, and it's truly a time where we have to think about this roadmap and the compass. I think technology could have the roadmap, and by technology, I'm referring to internet connectivity, reaching villages, mobile phone connectivity, and mobile phone penetration. We are seeing significant increase. I just looked at the numbers. I was just looking at that the other day, and the numbers are increasing even among young women, access to mobile phones and access to smartphones. So if we can harness these tiny little tools that young people are having in their hands, if we can harness these tools to become learning tools, skill building tools, this is what I have in mind. If we cannot beat the demographic pressure, let's try to beat the odds of having these lives wasted in waiting. We wrote about the generation of waiting. We cannot afford to write about another generation in waiting. So the roadmap to me, the compass is these tiny tools that are in the hands of every young person. And if these tiny tools, smartphones, can be utilized in a way where it leads to skill building, finding jobs, we can invest into that direction, then maybe we can mitigate. This is the term we can think about, mitigate the impact of the upcoming tsunami. That's my thinking. And thank you.
Well, what a nice way to conclude this panel. I have to say I haven't prepared any closing remarks because I was hoping that Dr. Badawi would have been with us and he would do so. But let me thank the panelists for this very rich and enlightening discussion. For the participants, I saw both Caroline and Raghi and others have been posting links and papers, which will be very useful for us to follow up. And other participants perhaps can write to Ramaj and ask for the links if they cannot download them from the YouTube if they missed the session. So from my part, let me thank you all of you. It was a great pleasure to connect. This is a positive externality of COVID, people that I wouldn't have seen because of the physical requirements to travel to conferences. We're seeing each other. And I hope we'll meet again and soon, and not only virtually. So thank you very much, panelists, and also Shirin and Ramaz and the ERF for this very nice opportunity to meet and discuss these things. So again, thank you very much, and bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you, Zefiris. Thanks, Shirin, Ramaj.
Thank you all.
Caroline, Raghi, Gada.
Thank you.
Yeah, indeed.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.